Supporters of Brazil's left-wing president-elect Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva have been celebrating his narrow election victory over Jair Bolsonaro, who has yet to concede. Large crowds of people have been dancing, chanting Lula's name and setting off fireworks amid a tight police presence. After a divisive campaign which saw two bitter rivals on opposite sides of the political spectrum go head-to-head, Lula won 50.9% of the votes. It caps a remarkable political comeback for the former leader. In his victory speech, Lula promised to govern for all Brazilians, vowing to end hunger and to protect the Amazon.
The defeated president, Bolsonaro, should have called me to recognize my victory. Up to now, he hasn't called. I don't know if he will or if he will concede. Carrying children and asking for food because there's nothing to eat. This is the country that is the third largest provider of food in the world. What is missing is the shame of those who govern the country. I am promising you all again, I have a lot of commitments, a lot of tasks, but the essential one is the guarantee that every child, woman, teenager and man can have a coffee, breakfast, lunch and dinner every day, the necessary calories needed. From the bottom of my heart, thank you God. And thanks to the people of Brazil, for the victory that you have given me. For this reason, I can't fail. And I know I can count on you all, with the certainty that we're going to fulfill all tasks we committed to you. I think the people have had enough of suffering.
Brazil's new president-elect, Lula da Silva. Meanwhile, supporters of incumbent Jair Bolsonaro have expressed disbelief and disappointment in the result. The far-right leader has not yet made a speech conceding defeat, but Brazilian state media are reporting that two leaders of Congress and the Senate have acknowledged Lula's victory, and both of them are political allies of Jair Bolsonaro. Well, I'm joined now by Arise correspondent Laurie Laird, who is monitoring events from London. So a moment in history, Laurie, taking place in Brazil. Lula da Silva beating Jair Bolsonaro, and that makes Mr. Bolsonaro the first Brazilian president to ever lose a re-election fight. But what a bitter fight and a tight race it was.
Absolutely, Charles. And I think that a lot of people in Brazil will feel relieved as and when Mr. Bolsonaro does, in fact, concede defeat, assuming he is going to concede defeat. We have heard absolutely nothing from him today. Cameras photographed him coming out of his house, photographed him traveling to the presidential palace. He went to work today, but as of now, no utterance. As you mentioned, a number of congressional allies have tweeted and have spoken publicly about their intention to respect the results. There was lots of confusion about what might happen because Bolsonaro borrowed during the campaign a page out of the Donald Trump playbook and had hinted on multiple occasions that the only result that he would acknowledge would be one in which he won. So there is a bit of nervousness about what could come next. And I think many people, with the exception of the most diehard Bolsonaro supporters, will be relieved as and when the man does concede defeat. So all waiting for that.
Well, yeah, but that's a very important point, and a point of curiosity to international watchers of Brazil. This decision so far by Jair Bolsonaro not to concede, how much does that matter?
Well, I think that it matters probably less than the events that we saw in the U.S. during the last change of power, and simply because so many lawmakers that are allies of Bolsonaro have come out and have said they do respect the result. In fact, one said that he intends to be a very strong opposition to the new president who will take office on the 1st of January. But you must remember that Bolsonaro's supporters on the ground are, while he didn't win a majority of votes, in the same way that Donald Trump supporters support him so much, Bolsonaro supporters are quite are extreme, are very, very vocal supporters. They believe in their man in almost a messianic way, and that's sort of cultural that Donald Trump had also cultured. So I think that part of the electorate that may be disgruntled is still something that people are nervously watching, not least because Bolsonaro has been a very, very strong supporter of gun rights. He has never disavowed violence. So there are many parallels, people think, between Donald Trump and the man who has styled himself as the Trump of the tropics.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, on the other side of the fence, this election result marks a stunning comeback for Lula. He was jailed for 18 months for corruption, so an endorsement of all he stands for and one of the great political comebacks of all time.
It's hard to imagine more of a comeback than this. More than 500 days in jail. Lula was finally released when his conviction for corruption charges was annulled. But my word, what a comeback. And Lula hasn't talked a great deal about his economic plan, but he has gone back to his particular playbook, which is talking about poverty, which is talking about child hunger. During his 2 terms in office before his jailing, he implemented a landmark program in Brazil that gave direct payments to very, very poor households for this reason, to make sure that children weren't going hungry. There were also payments to households to make sure that their children went to school. It was widely considered as a successful program in terms of reducing poverty, and has been copied in some form or another in other parts of Latin America and other parts of the developing world. Slight problem now is that was a very, very expensive program. It really deprived the Brazilian exchequer of much funds, and that got Lula's successors into trouble because there simply wasn't enough money to spend across the economy. Lula is hearkening back to those things again. He's hearkening back to expanded public spending, and despite the fact that Bolsonaro has been a rather controversial president, business leaders kind of gritted their teeth and did support Bolsonaro because they feel he has a slightly better understanding of fiscal tightness and the need to pay some attention to looking at revenues before you spend them.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, those specific policies are what why a lot of people in Brazil voted for Lula. And amid the congratulatory messages coming in for Lula from world leaders, the mood among his supporters, nothing more than totally jubilant.
Absolutely. And it's interesting when you mention those messages of support from world leaders. We have Vladimir Putin, we have President Joe Biden, and interesting in Joe Biden's words of support, he did say that he viewed this, or election observers viewed this, as a free and fair election, almost trying to preempt anything that may come out of Bolsonaro's mouth. We had good wishes from Rishi Sunak, the new UK Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. So a real cross-section of leaders, not just some of the authoritarian leaders that Bolsonaro seemed to, want to identify with. But going back to the economics, Charles, I think it's very, very interesting to point out that despite the controversy that surrounded Bolsonaro, the Brazilian economy did very, very well under his tutelage. Now, part of that was giving independence to the Brazilian central bank. The Brazilian central bank began raising interest rates a year before the U.S. Federal Reserve did. So inflation in Brazil, which has historically been such a big problem for the Brazilian economy, inflation in Brazil is largely under control at this moment. In fact, lower than in the US and lower than the European Union. It's a different situation now. Brazil is very commodity driven. Prices for some of those commodities are falling. Inflation, while it's not as high as in the US and Europe, is still high and crippling a number of households. The money for that sort of support that Lula is discussing may not be there at this point.
Very informative analysis as always, Laurie. Thank you very much indeed.